Hello, my name is Avery Bishop. I'm going to be speaking today about deploying Windows 2000 in an international environment. I think you'll find this to be a really exciting topic. It certainly is one of my favorite things to talk about. And I really enjoy talking about this topic because we've made great advances, I believe, in Windows 2000 in the international area over the past few years. Some of the issues that we solved in Windows 2000 relating to international, they concentrate in two areas. Issues having to do with the customer focus and with the IT group in a particular in a company or an enterprise. And so I'll be talking about those two first of all. The first thing is basically the basic message is multilingual communications, and there are two areas that concentrates in. As you see in this first slide, the first one is being able to create and exchange documents in various languages and with various locale settings. You'd like to be able, for example, to exchange email in maybe Mandarin Chinese when you're running on a Korean operating system or a German operating system. And in the past, that hasn't been possible. You might also want to be able to create a Japanese document and embed some Arabic or some Hebrew or something like that when running on a French operating system. So this aspect of it concentrates on creating document content in various languages. The second is being able to choose the user interface as appropriate for the one that's preferred by the user. And that's, again, something that hasn't been selectable in the past, but as we'll see in the demos and in the discussion that follows later, that's something that we've added to Windows 2000. So, for example, you might have someone who's a Japanese executive, for example, who's visiting Paris or is on a long-term stay in Paris or Germany or somewhere, and most of the operating systems there are in that local language, but he wants to be able to use it in his particular language. So, and in that case, he'd like to be able to, for example, to use Japanese. Another example is you might have a guest system that you use for visitors from around the world in your enterprise, and each one would like to be able to use that same machine with their own account and with their own user interface language. And that's, again, something that we've added for Windows 2000, and we'll see that, and we'll see demos of it. It's really quite exciting. So the second set of customer issues are those that have to do with the IT group in an enterprise and how you support the users throughout that enterprise. You'd like to be able to support the different language and locale requirements from one centralized location. You'd like to be able to do it easily without a lot of upgrades and without multiple problems in a heterogeneous, different language environment. You'd also like to be able to maintain the different language versions, install service packs, and so on easily. And also, when you have different language mixes, as you know, that's caused problems in the past, and so that's also some of the issues that we're going to address today. So first, let's now step back and look at some of the key concepts involved in the international support in Windows 2000. First of all, what's a locale? If you look that up in the dictionary, it says it's a place or a locality. It's used throughout the computer industry, and it has been used by, for example, the old XPG group and so on to mean different things, but the usual meaning for it in the computer industry is a set of user preferences that have to do with language or ethnicity or local customs, things such as date and time format and so on. And we'll see some examples of this in a minute. The problem is that within Microsoft, I'm sorry to say, we use it in a lot of different ways, and some of them are contradictory and a little confusing. So we're going to talk about what we mean by locale and what are the various ways we use that. So the way that we use it that's closest to the real definition, the way it should be used, is the user default locale. And we'll see this in the demo, where you can set the way the system formats numbers or currency, date and time for you, the way it sorts text strings and so on. That's called the user default locale, and it's also overridable by the user himself or herself. The second way that we use it is really not a locale. We have something called the system default locale, and we'll see that in the demo. It's really a misnomer, and it should be called something like the ANSI emulation mode, and we'll talk about this in quite a bit of detail as well. It determines how a non-Unicode or ANSI application, how that runs on the system. Some other related concepts are things like language groups. We'll see this when we bring up the control panel, the regional options applet. Take a look at that, and you'll see a list of language groups, and we'll see how you can install those. When you install a language group, you install all of the files that are required to support the languages in that group. So, for example, the Arabic language group includes not only Arabic, but also Persian, and in the future it will include Urdu and Pashto and so on. The Hebrew language group includes Hebrew, of course, but also Yiddish. So that's an example of one language group that includes more than one language. The Indic language group also includes Hindi and Marathi and Tamil and so on. So that's another example of that sort of thing. When you install a language group, you install all the files that are required for that. You installed, for example, the fonts, the conversion routines for ANSI applications, input methods if it's one of the Far East language groups, and so on. In some cases, there's special files that are required for display. For example, in the Arabic and the Hebrew language groups, there's a special module that's used to lay out the character strings correctly. We'll talk a little bit about this as well. Okay, the next concept is the input locale. Now, this is something that also is not well understood. People tend to talk about a keyboard layout. And they really should be talking about an input locale. An input locale is a combination of two things. It's a language, the language of the script that's being entered, in combination with a method of input. And we'll see this when we do the demo, that you're talking about a pair of things, the language and the method of input. And you can install input locales, and you can switch within input locales from various input locales within an application. Okay, and we'll see this as well. Some other concepts. I've mentioned script a couple of times, and we're going to talk about it several times throughout this presentation. But I want to make it clear that when I say script, I mean to use it in the traditional sense of a collection of characters that are used to represent text, not something like VBScript or JavaScript. Okay. Enabling and localization are two other terms that people sometimes confuse. When you say you've enabled an application for a particular language, you mean you make it possible for that application to deal with that language. So, for example, you might start out with an application that's written assuming English as the character as the language that's being displayed, and then you enable it for Japanese or for Arabic, and that means you make it possible for that application to display Arabic, Japanese, or Arabic. That's what's meant by that. But it has nothing to do with the user interface. The user interface is a separate issue. All right, and again, we'll see this in a demo in a few minutes, where we have various user interfaces in an application, but the content, what's displayed within the client area of that application, is separate from the user interface. The user interface is the localization end of things. So there are those two things that you have to keep in mind. Localization means translation of the user interface, whereas enabling means making it possible for users to enter and display characters in that particular language. So let's take a look at some of these things that I've talked about, the various locales, and how you're able to set them within your own Windows 2000 operating system. All right, so let's look at the various locales and language groups that we discussed earlier. We go into Settings in the Start menu, bring up Control Panel, and then we will bring up the Regional Options applet. And the first thing we see at the bottom of the Regional Applets panel is a list of language groups. And you notice that I have all of them installed here. You can install any or all of them, whatever ones you need for support on your system. All right. And then notice that we have here the locale. This is the user locale that we discussed earlier that has to do with time and date and currency format, sorting, and so on. In fact, let's take that now and let's change that to the Arabic Saudi Arabian user locale, and I'll go look at the date, and you'll notice it says the Hijri calendar. This is a lunar calendar that it's used in much of the Arab world. The other thing is, though, I can override that, even though the default date format for the Arabic Saudi Arabian locale is the Hijri calendar. I can change that to the Gregorian calendar in French, for example. So that's one of the features of user locales. Now let's look at input locales. We talked about input locales. Remember, it's a language associated with a method of input. I have US English and the US keyboard, but I can, for example, if I look at Japanese, you'll see that it has the Japanese input system. MSIME 2000 is the method of input. It's an IME, an input method editor associated with the Japanese language. And there's the InScript keyboard layout associated with Hindi and so on. Back to the general tab here. We talked about the locale. This is the user locale. I can set the system default locale, which has to do with ANSI emulation mode, as we discussed, by pushing on set default here. All right. One other thing you should know is that you can change the input locale yourself by clicking on this little indicator that you see on the system tray. You can switch from one input locale to another within an application. It's a per thread setting, by the way, so you can have multiple input locales within an application. In fact, if we bring up Notepad here, we can see that. And I can go into Notepad and I can type in various languages. This is I can switch the input locale either by selecting from the input locale indicator here. I can switch to Arabic, for example. And let's make the font a little bigger just to make it easier to see. Make that larger. And now I can type in Arabic. I can switch to, I can switch the input locale to something else, say Hebrew, and I can type. All right, so that's how that works. That's how all the locales work. Now, how does Windows 2000 deal with all these things? What are some of the new features that are in Windows 2000, and how does that relate to you as someone who's setting up a system or deploying it in an international setting? Well, first of all, in Windows 2000, we've added support for new languages and cultures. We have Armenian and Georgian from the former Soviet Union. We have, as I mentioned earlier, support for Arabic and Hebrew, and support for Indian languages. The Devanagari script, which covers Hindi, Marathi, Konkani, and Sanskrit, as well as the Tamil script. So we've added lots of support for these complex scripts, and also we've added support for locales, the associated locales, so you can have the proper calendar support, date and time format, and currency support, and so on. We've also, the second major part of or major feature that we've added to Windows 2000 is the integrated language support. And what that means is that Windows 2000 is based on a single set of core binary files. And so every version of Windows 2000 is enabled for all supported languages. All right, instead of having a separate Japanese version and a Korean version and an Arabic version and so on. Now, actually, we still have, of course, have the localized versions, but each one of those versions is based on the same set of files. So that, for example, the Japanese version is enabled for Korean, for Arabic, for Indic languages, and so on. And you can run an Indian language application on your Hebrew version of Windows 2000, or on any other version for that matter. That's what the single core binaries, the integrated language support means. And again, we'll get into this in more detail in a few minutes. And the third major initiative in Windows 2000 is the multi-language version. We'll talk about this in a lot of detail, but this basically allows each user to select their user interface as they'd like. So let's first talk about new languages and cultures, as I mentioned a minute ago. As I said, we added support for complex scripts. Now, a complex script is one that requires special processing. Remember, in this case, when I say script, I mean not VB script or JavaScript, but a collection of characters. So, for example, the Arabic script, as I said, covers Pashto and Urdu, Persian, and of course Arabic. These are some of the issues that we run into in dealing with complex scripts. First of all, there's bidirectional rearrangement. That means that in the case of, for example, Hebrew is normally written right to left, but if you have English text mixed in with the Hebrew, then it is displayed left to right. And if you have punctuation that comes between the Hebrew and the English, then you have to follow an algorithm to decide where the punctuation goes. Does it go with the Hebrew or with the English? And numbers and so on have a very complex way of being displayed, and that's called the Unicode bidirectional algorithm or BIDI algorithm. So that's one of the issues that we run into. The second is contextual shaping. Arabic and the Indian languages have this property that a character, the shape that a character takes on when it's displayed depends on what characters came before and after in the stream. And so as you type Arabic, for example, you'll see not only the new character that you type, but the characters you type before that will change shape as you're typing. It's actually very, very interesting and intriguing language. And a similar thing for Indian languages, and we'll see a slide that gives a little more detail on this in the next slide. Combining characters are also an issue that we deal with in complex scripts. For example, Arabic takes, and Hebrew also in some cases, take special marks to indicate the vowel sound that is associated with a particular syllable. Thai also has vowel and tone marks, and so Indian languages also sometimes have combining marks. Some of the languages that we deal with have special word break and justification rules. For example, Thai does not have an enumerable set of delimiters that you can use, you can look for to break words. If you see a string of Thai text, it's all one long string. There's no breaks in there, no spaces or anything like that. And therefore, we have to have a special algorithm and actually a dictionary lookup to break a stream of Thai text into words. And that's also provided by the system in Windows 2000. And finally, there are some scripts that have some combinations of letters that don't make any sense in the orthography of the language. And examples are Indian languages, the Indian scripts, and Thai, where, for example, in the case of Thai, you can type a base consonant followed by a vowel and a tone mark, but you can't have two vowels in a row. It just doesn't make any sense. And so we provide a facility within the language, within the operating system, where you can block that and make it impossible for the user to type something that doesn't make sense in that language. Here's an example of the kinds of issues that I'm talking about, the things that we run into in complex scripts. And I'm going to go over this very quickly because it's just an overview. But if you have more questions or interest in this, you should look at some of the websites that I show at the end of this presentation. You'll see here that there are 4 characters at the beginning in this bitmap here. It's the Rafe character followed by a Halent, which combines with that together, and you'll see what happens is that those 2 characters at the beginning of this 4-character cluster combine together to form a little hook here. That's a hook on top of of this character cluster. And then there comes the base consonant, the K character, and then there's this E, short E character, which actually gets displayed to the left of the whole cluster. So all these 4 characters end up as one cluster together in the case of the Hindi language. The next example is I have a base consonant here in Tamil followed by a vowel. And this is one vowel character, but notice what happens when it gets displayed. This is very intriguing. One of this vowel character, it's one character, but half of it goes to the left of the base consonant and the other half goes to the right. And that shows you, again, one of the issues that we deal with in Tamil. What this means is that you can't make assumptions in software about the relationship between the number of characters and the number of glyphs, because in this case I have one character, this character, which is displayed as 2 glyphs, one to the right and one to the left of the preceding character in the stream. And these are some other examples. This is Thai, where there's a base character and a vowel and a tone mark. This is called the Saram character, and it's one character, but it consists of a ring and a hook. A small ring and a hook, and they're displayed together. And actually, they have to be displayed as two glyphs because sometimes when you justify text, you put space between those two. And there are sometimes the height of this glyph, the ring, depends on the character that came before. So that's another issue that we deal with in complex scripts. But again, this is all taken care of by the operating system itself. Applications generally don't have to be concerned about this. They can just make use of the services within the operating system to display these complex scripts correctly. And these are examples from Arabic and from Vietnamese. Again, if you have more interest in this, I would encourage you to go to the website to look into it. Okay. Another feature that we've added in Windows 2000 is the right-to-left orientation or mirroring of the user interface in the Arabic and Hebrew versions. This is a bitmap that's taken from Arabic Windows 98, but it's the Arabic version of Windows 2000 will be similar. And you'll notice that the menu proceeds from right to left here, that there's File here on the right and Help on the left. For those of you who can read that, I won't claim to be able to read it, but trust me, that's what it says. And you'll notice that the back arrow points this way to the right. Notice here's a tree control that cascades down from right to left. This is all part of the right to left orientation of the operating system. The Start button, by the way, is on the lower right-hand corner of the Arabic user interface. So in Arabic and Hebrew Windows 2000 will have a similar feature. And the important point here is that applications will also be able to take advantage of this. We have a new application programming user interface that allows the programmers to also program an application to also lay out its user interface from right to left. So that's the first thing, the new features for new scripts that we've talked about earlier. Now let's talk about worldwide core binaries, the fact that Windows 2000 is based on a single set of binaries for all versions of the operating system. What that means is the fact that Windows 2000 uses the same binary files for all versions, all localized versions, means that it's enabled for all versions. We talked about enabling earlier, the content of a document. Okay, this means that users can enter text in any of the supported languages, assuming they have an application that supports this. But for example, you can bring up Notepad and you can type in Arabic on a simplified Chinese version of Windows 2000, or you can type in simplified Chinese on a Danish version of Windows 2000. All right, and you can store that document, you can print it out, you can do anything that you would normally do within that language. It's also enabled for applications. So a well-written Win32 application can take advantage of this multiple enabling, and it can be multilingual, and it can also run on very different systems. So again, within some restrictions that we'll talk about, you can run an Arabic application on your Swedish version of Windows 2000, and so on. So the advantage to users are, as I mentioned, one, that you can enter text in multiple languages, and you can run various applications, different language-enabled applications on one single system. The advantage to developers is that developers can develop an application. They can develop all language versions of their application on one system, and they can also do the same thing that Windows 2000 does, is they can develop a single binary application. And we encourage people to do that. And if you are an application developer, I would encourage you to look at the websites that come at the end of this presentation for more information on how to do that. And then in the information technology group, if that's the kind of group that you're in and you're more interested in managing systems for the users within your enterprise, you'll also find advantages to this single binary architecture of Windows 2000. There are fewer system differences because they're all based on the same binary files. It means we're going to have fewer service packs, and it's going to make maintenance and administration much easier. And we'll see exactly what that means in future slides here. And the way that we do this is we base all text processing in the system on Unicode. Now, we've actually done this in the past. Those of you who are familiar with NT from the old days know that even in NT 3.1 was based on Unicode internally. but that we didn't use the same core binary files, and we've moved to that in Windows 2000. So all binary files are enabled for all script, and since they are, we don't have to have a different kernel 32 or a different GDI .dll, GDI32.dll for Japanese and for Korean and for Arabic and Hebrew. We just use the same ones for all versions. And then what we do is we collect all of those special files like font files and input locales and the translation files and things like that, the locale files that go in the NLS files. We collect all those into what we call a language group. So when you install a language group, you install all of the files that are required and all of the settings in the registry that are required for that language group. So this is one thing to keep in mind. When we say that Windows 2000 is enabled for all languages, in order to enable it, you have to install the appropriate language group. It's not automatic. But the language groups and all the files that are required come on the single CD that you get. You don't have to purchase anything separately. All right. So that's the good news. If you want to install Indian language support, no matter where you are, if you bought your version of Windows 2000 in Topeka, Kansas, or wherever, or is it Kansas? I think it is. then you can just use the CD the standard CD, plug it in, and you can install Indian language support or Hebrew or whatever. Okay, so let's talk about Unicode for those of you who aren't familiar with it and what it means to you, because this is going to affect how you set up, how you deploy Windows 2000 in an international environment. First of all, Unicode is, as we'll see in a minute when we talk about it in a little more detail, it's an international character encoding that includes all of the commonly used characters in the world today. All right, there are a few characters that or scripts that have to be added in Unicode 3.0, but they will be, for example, Khmer, the Cambodian language, that will be added in Windows or in Unicode 3.0. But for the most part, it covers all scripts in common use today. And what this means is that since we have based Windows 2000 and all of the system components on Unicode, it means that they are enabled for multilingual content. So, for example, IE 5.0 does everything internally in Unicode, and we'll see in the demo in a minute that means you can display multilingual web pages, and we'll see a really cool web page when we get to that. Other components of the system, such as the file system, WinLogon, and so on, are also enabled for multilingual content using Unicode. That means that you can log in with a multilingual username if you'd like to. And the other thing is that applications can take advantage of this. Office 2000, for example, is based on Unicode, and it's therefore multilingual. And if you're an application developer, I would encourage you to develop a Unicode application. Here's a little more detail about Unicode. For those of you who are new to the subject, it's a 16-bit character encoding going from 0, which is the null, through FFFF. And you see here, this is again just gives you an idea of how it's laid out. To get the latest details, I would encourage you to check out the Unicode website, which is www.unicode.org, and that has information about how to purchase the book as well. But the point is that all characters are represented as 16-bit values. So, for example, capital A is, instead of being just hex 41, it's hex 0041 because it's 16 bits, and so on. The nice thing about Unicode, though, is that it's unambiguous. When you see one of these 16-bit values, you know exactly what it is, right? This is, those of you who are familiar with the ANSI 8-bit encodings know that this is a real problem. When you see a byte of text, you don't really know what character that represents unless you know what char set or what code page it's associated with. And in some cases, it can be a real problem. In the DBCS character encodings, for example, when you see a byte, you don't know what it really represents, even though you know that it's code page 932, the Japanese code page, because it might be, in some cases, a trail byte, the second half of a 2-byte character. This is not the case with Unicode. With Unicode, you have an unambiguous encoding. You see one of these 16-bit values, and you know exactly what it signifies. Okay, there are some relatives of Unicode that you should be aware of. Unicode is ++, plane 0 of the ISO 10646 standard, a 32-bit standard. They like to think of it as 64K planes of 64K characters each, and the 0th plane is Unicode. It has the same repertoire, the same set of characters as Unicode. And the Unicode consortium works very closely with the ISO standard to make sure that they keep the two in sync. UTF-7 is a transformation of Unicode into a stream of bytes that only use 7 bits each. And I'm not going to talk very much about this because it's not very important. But let's talk about UTF-8. This is another transformation of Unicode into, it's a serialization of Unicode into bytes, which avoid the problem bytes that can be a problem with legacy software and hardware, the control bytes from 0 to 1F and 7F to A0. It avoids those, and therefore it's useful in situations where you don't know where that text is going to end up. So for example, it's very useful on the web. A lot of people encourage people to, actually the W3C consortium is encouraging people to use UTF-8 as their encoding for web pages, because you don't know where it's going to end up, but you know it'll be safe if you've encoded it in UTF-8. It won't get hammered by some legacy software or hardware. Why have I talked so much about Unicode up to date? Okay, why is this important? Well, most applications are based on the ANSI style of encoding of characters. That is, it's based on 8-bit bytes. So there are single-byte character sets and 8-bit double-byte character sets, and I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail, but suffice it to say that this, you can think of this as sort of legacy from the days of the OEM code pages of DOS, from Windows 3.1, and so on. And Windows 2000 uses Unicode, but it provides conversion between the system code page and Unicode for ANSI applications. ANSI applications, again, they're assuming that they're always dealing with the system in an 8-bit code page, and so when they pass text to the system, they're using the system code page. The system translates that into Unicode, does whatever was requested by the application, and then if there are results to send back, it converts them back into the system code page and sends them back. Okay. The system default locale that we talked about earlier, about the fact that it emulates, its ANSI emulation mode, that determines what the system code page is. Now what this means is that if you're running Windows 2000 and you're running, say, French Windows 2000, and you set the system code page to Japanese, then an ANSI application will think that it's running on Japanese Windows 98. That's what the system default locale actually signifies. So but it also means that ANSI applications, it's very difficult to make an ANSI application that's multilingual beyond some very small set of languages. Okay, so for example, if you use code page 1232, which is Western Europe, then you can represent French and German and Spanish and Italian and English, and other Western European languages. But you can't represent Japanese or Korean or Arabic with code page 1252. But with Unicode, that's all possible. So that's why this is significant, and I bring this up because it's going to affect how you deploy your Windows 2000 systems in an international environment. So now let's look at a demo which shows Internet Explorer 5.0 with a multilingual page using the UTF-8 character encoding, multilingual content. All right, let's look at a multilingual web page now based on the Unicode technology that we mentioned earlier. It uses UTF-8 as the encoding. This is a web page. There are no tricks here. It's actual text encoded in UTF-8, no graphics. Sometimes you'll see pages on the web that display things like Hindi and Arabic and so on using bitmaps, but this is actual Unicode encoded text. There it is, folks. We'll kind of go slowly down through the page, and you can see there are 47 different languages displayed here. There's Tamil at the bottom there now. This is the Inuktitut language, by the way. We don't have a system font for that, but if we go view source, we can see how that's done, how we provide that. It's done by something called an embedded font technology. And some of the fonts, some of the characters won't show up in Notepad when we display them here, and they'll show up as boxes because the system doesn't have the fonts available. But, for example, Armenian, here you should see that as boxes. And earlier we saw Nuktitut, some of the others. And the reason for that, again, is because this page uses embedded fonts, that embedded font technology to display those characters. Others, such as the Russian here, display correctly, and the Arabic is displaying correctly because I have that language group installed. Okay, now the third point that we brought up, the third initiative of Windows 2000 that we want to talk about, and we'll see how this affects you as well, is the multi-language technology. Okay, we already talked quite a bit about enabling, and these are some of the goals of the multi-language technology of Windows 2000. It enables multi-language infrastructure for end users and for IT managers. Okay, IT managers, network administrators, people who are setting up systems and that sort of thing. And it makes it easy to do that administration and reduce the total cost of ownership of Windows 2000 in a multi-language environment. So this gives you an idea of this gives you an idea of how that works. If you think back to the good old days of NT Workstation 4.0 or Windows 95 or Windows 98, when you had a mixture of users from various countries and with various language needs, you basically had to deploy a different system for each one of them. You'd had maybe a German Windows 98 system. You might have an Arabic-enabled Windows NT4 system. You might have a Japanese NT4 system. But when you shared data across those, or when you tried to view file names or log in from one system to the other, you noticed that there were problems. So as you see at the bottom here, we have this new thing called the multi-language version of Windows 2000 Professional. And that supports all of the same languages in the same operating system. So that's, again, we're going to talk about this in quite a bit of detail, but it's all in one operating system. Again, keep in mind that there are these two aspects of this. There's the there's the enabling side of it and the user interface side of it, and they are separate, very separate systems, very separate issues. Okay, so this is the core of this is the multi-language version of Windows 2000. And what this means is that the menus and dialogues are a per user setting. Each user gets to set up what language he or she wants for the user interface to be in. And so you can have one user log in with a Japanese user interface and another one with an Arabic user interface, for example. We'll see a demo of this in a minute. It's sold through the Microsoft Open License Program, through Select, and through the Enterprise Agreement programs. And it's available to developers through MSDN. If you're a developer and you want to take advantage of this and test your application on the multi-language version, you can do that. Some parts of the operating system stay in English. For example, the 16-bit pieces, we don't translate those. This is on the multi-language version, by the way. In the localized versions, they are translated. These are translated, these various components. But in the multi-language version, these parts stay in English. So this is something to be aware of, and it might affect how you deploy in your own particular scenario. Bitmaps are not translated either. Registry values and so on. There are some situations where some components of the system get some strings from the registry, and those registry settings are not converted for the multi-language version. They're not translated, and therefore they would stay in English. And there are some special folders and special usernames, for example. The administrator is translated into various languages in some of the localized versions. In the Spanish version, for example, the administrator file or username. And some special folders such as program files and my documents and so on, they're translated into various languages on some localized versions. In the multi-language version, they stay in English. So this is something to be aware of. So which should you use? Should you purchase the localized version, deploy the localized version, or Windows 2000, the standard English version, or the multi-language version? Well, first of all, if you're not concerned about the user interface, the English user interface is fine, then keep in mind that it is already enabled for all of the languages. So you can type in any language, any of the supported languages. You can run an application in any of the supported languages on the standard English version, or for that matter on any other version. So if that's all you need is document content in various languages, then the standard English version might be sufficient for you. If, on the other hand, you have a group of people and they all prefer to use the system in the same user interface language, for example, everyone in your enterprise or within some group in the enterprise prefers to work in Japanese, then you'd want to deploy the Japanese localized version of Windows 2000. If you're in a situation where you need multiple user interface languages within the same system or within a domain, for example, you might want to consider the multi-language version in that case, because the multi-language version really counts as one localized version, and it works with other copies of itself the best, and it doesn't really act like a heterogeneous environment in that case. So here's some more guidelines on this. These are the capabilities that are provided by the various versions. First of all, the standard English version. As I said, it's enabled. In fact, let's look at this first column here. This is the enabling. You can input, you can view, you can print in all of the supported languages on all versions of Windows 2000. The enabling, again, is because of the single binary approach we've taken in Windows 2000. The localized version gives you, of course, enabling for the target language itself. Like, for example, if you're talking about the Korean version of Windows 2000, it's obviously enabled for Korean, but it's also enabled for every other language. And it's also fully localized to the Korean language in that case. All right? The multi-language version is also, of course, enabled for all supported languages, but it allows each user to set the user interface language for as he or she would prefer. And as it says here, about 90% of the user interface is localized. It's only some very small part of it that's not localized. All right, so menus, dialog boxes, help files, and so on. And some of the file names and so on, as we discussed earlier, are not localized. If you're in a management situation, the IT part of an enterprise, for example, then I think you'll find that you'll be able to manage the multi-language version the easiest, rather than having a mixture of various different language versions. And so that's what we encourage people to do. You'll be able to deploy just one service pack for all of the client systems in your domain, for example, if you use the multi-language version. So that's another one, set of guidelines for deploying U.S. English version versus localized version versus the multi-language version. So if you're in any kind of a mixed language environment at all, I really would encourage you to use the multi-language version. I think that's probably the best practice in any kind of multiple user interface situation. You have the best data sharing, best roaming user scenario. We'll talk about this in a minute as well. Best connectivity and so on. So let's do a demo here. We're going to look at now, we're going to see the multi-language version of Windows 2000 in practice, and we're going to also bring up a little demo application and see how that works. All right, let's look at the multi-language user interface that I discussed a minute ago. I'm going to log in here as somebody called Joe User. And notice that Joe User comes up with the Japanese user interface. It'll take a minute because there's some caching that has to happen within the system. But here we have the Japanese user interface. As I mentioned, not everything in the system is localized. For example, these names of these folders are not localized. But as you can see, the start menu is localized here. And control panel, this is control panel in Japanese. And if I bring up control panel, you'll see most of the components with Japanese names. All right. And if I bring up Notepad at this point, you'll notice that Notepad comes up with a Japanese user interface as well. Remember, the user interface, as I said before, is independent of the content of the document. So I can still type in any language I want, any language that's installed here. Switch that to Hebrew, switch it to Arabic. That's actually Japanese. Let's switch to Arabic. And all of those work. Other thing I'd like you to note is that I can bring up this little application. This is a sample application that implements multi-language user interface itself. And it comes up automatically in Japanese. And in a minute when we log on as a different user, we'll see that it comes up in a different user interface automatically in that case. Here I have a selection box to let me select a different user interface. And I'll select the Hindi user interface in this case, and notice that I now get Hindi, a Hindi user interface for this application. Again, multi-language user interface within an application. Now let's log off and log back on as a different user. I'm going to log in this time as someone whose name is the Arabic word salam. And notice I can change the input locale here in the Win logon screen. Now it's at Hebrew, and now it's at Arabic. And so I now have an Arabic username in Win logon. I'm going to switch back to English for my password. And notice what happens when I bring up the Arabic user interface now for this user. This will come up with a right to left orientation. You notice the start button is on the right here. And if I bring up Explorer, notice that Explorer has a right to left orientation. The menu is right to left. I have a tree control that's right to left oriented, all in the Arabic user interface. Now let's go back to that same application. This points to the same binary, by the way. Again, it's a little sample application that, and the source code for this is available on the web and will also be available in the SDK. And notice that it automatically came up in Arabic this time, and that's because it detected the user interface of the current user and selected its user interface language in that to be the same. And notice again that it also has the right to left orientation. And I can switch the user interface at this point. It came up in that default value, but I can switch it to Hebrew, for example, or to one of the other values. Switch it back to Japanese, for example. One more thing I'd like to show you, back in Control Panel again. Control Panel now has an Arabic user interface. And I can go to Regional Options, and I can go to this setting right here. We didn't discuss this before, but this will allow me to set the user interface language of the user. So the user can change the user interface language to be some other value. within this using this drop-down box. Now we can log back off again and log back on and restart the presentation. So when it comes time to upgrade, what are the upgrade paths that are available to you? Basically, for the multi-language version, you can upgrade it in any way that you can upgrade the English version. And what this means is, and this is sort of the bad news, there's no cross-language upgrade possible. You cannot upgrade from German Windows 2000 to the multi-language version of Windows 2000, for example, or Japanese Windows NT4 to a multi-language version of Windows 2000. You have to upgrade from US NT4 or US Windows 2000 to the multi-language version. All right? So this is something, again, to keep in mind when you make the decisions about which language versions to deploy. When it comes time to set up a multi-language version, a workstation, or I guess it's now called Windows 2000 Professional multi-language version, what you should do is select the languages that are to be installed on that system. Okay, so if you need, you bring up the installation package, and if you want to support, independent of what user interfaces you're going to be displaying, if you want to see document content in Arabic and Hebrew and French and English, for example, you'll want to be sure to install the Arabic language group, the Hebrew language group, and the Western European language group to cover French and English. And then you'll want to install the language groups associated with the user interface languages that you want to support. If you want, let's say you want Arabic and French user interfaces, you'll want to install those language groups as well. There's a graphical user interface setup, and there's a little regional settings dialog box that looks very much like the regional options dialog box in the control panel. And you'll go into that and you'll set the default system locale. This is important because this tells the system what ANSI mode to emulate. So if you're going to be running Arabic Win32 applications that are ANSI applications, not Unicode applications, on your system, you'll want to set the system default locale to one of the Arabic locales. We have 16 Arabic locales. And remember, this is a per machine setting, so this is not settable by each user. It's that machine, that whole system has that setting. And it also requires a reboot. Okay? So after that, then you'll set the user default locale, and this is, as we mentioned earlier, this affects date, time, currency, and so on. And this is a per user setting. Each user can set this, but you'll want to set a default value for this that all users automatically get when they first log on, and then they'll be able to change that later. You'll want to set the default input language. This is so that when people first begin typing, the input locale will be as they expect it. So if they usually type in Japanese, you'll want to set the default input language to Japanese, and then that will give them that input locale automatically. And then you can also add other options, other input locales as required, either during setup or afterwards from the regional options dialog box. You can also do all of these international settings, by the way, in unattended setup. So here's some guidelines on choosing computer names. Now, within a homogeneous Windows 2000 environment, you can use Unicode for DNS names. So you can use it for computer names, you can use it for usernames, for printer names, and so on. But in reality, if you need those various DNS names to be visible to down-level clients, such as Windows 95, Windows 98, maybe even in a heterogeneous situation from a Mac client, that sort of thing, then you'll want to make sure that you use a character set that's visible to those clients. So we encourage people, if there's any possibility that they'll have a heterogeneous environment like this, to restrict the names to ASCII, even though the capability is there for multilingual names because of the use of UTF-8 and DNS. If you do use characters that are not supported by down-level clients, you'll get a warning about it, so you can change the name at that point. Again, for account names and passwords, the same thing. Be very careful about this. If you're you're going to be running only on Windows 2000, all of your workstations are Windows 2000, then feel free to use Unicode, to use mixed scripts in usernames and passwords. But if there's a possibility that someone will have to log in on a Windows 98 machine, then you would want to avoid that. And it's better to restrict the characters used to the ASCII character set. Also, there can be problems with roaming profiles, which we'll mention in a minute. Even within a heterogeneous Windows 2000 environment, if the user goes from one machine to another and that other machine doesn't have the language group installed to display his name or for him to enter his username or password, then he won't be able to log on that machine. So that's another reason for restricting the characters to be used to some set that will be covered by all the machines. Of course, one workaround for this is to install all the language groups required on all machines if you have an enclosed system where you have control over that. Now, we'll see in a minute in a demo with WinLogon, you can change the input locale as well. So you can change from switch your keyboard layout, for example, so that you're typing in Hindi for your username or in Arabic for your username. But again, that assumes that you've installed in this case, let's say Arabic, that you've installed the Arabic language group during installation. Okay, because that affects the default user, and even if you install Windows 2000 and you don't install the Arabic language group, and afterwards you install the Arabic the Arabic language group and input locale, you still won't be able to type in Arabic when WinLogon comes up. And the reason is because it's required that you had done that during installation of the system itself, because those languages are associated with the default user. All right. Okay, there's some other issues with mixed domains. If you have a situation of one domain talking to another or one system talking to another, you have, for example, if you have a Japanese Windows 95 system and it sees and it accesses a Windows 2000 system that has a Greek file name, then you'll see machine name for that Windows 2000 system. That machine name will appear as boxes, which means the font required to display those characters isn't present on the Windows 95 system, or it'll display as question marks, which means when it was converted from Unicode to ANSI, the characters required were not in the system code page. That's what the question marks means. You might be able to still access that computer. You might be able to click on it with the mouse. You might even be able to go to a directory and access files in it, but you can't see what the name of the computer is very well. So this is, again, a situation where you might want to encourage the domain administrators to restrict themselves to ASCII or to some subset of Unicode that all machines will be able to view. I mentioned this a minute ago, that the localized versions of Windows 2000 have localized group and folder names, and also usernames, special usernames such as administrator, special group names such as administrators. These are localized on some of the localized systems, and some of the folder names are also localized as well. Whereas in the multi-language version, they remain in English. And what this means is this simplifies things for you, the fact that they remain in English. because if you have if you have a domain with mixed clients, you have a Japanese Windows 2000 and German Windows 2000 and Danish Windows 2000, they may have different names for My Documents and for program files and so on. And if you have a roaming user go from one to the other, then you can have issues with that, where you have different names on the different localized versions. Whereas if you take the same scenario and we have, instead of having the localized versions, we have the multi-language version. So one person has the user interface, one machine has the user interface set to Japanese, another one to Danish, and another one to German. Then there's not going to be an issue when you go from one to the other, because they're essentially the same system, but they've got just a different user interface setting. So roaming profiles, we mentioned this a minute ago. As you see here at the bottom, roaming works best between machines with the same localized version of Windows. Of course, it's simple if you're going from US English Windows 2000 to another Windows 2000, US English Windows 2000 system. But it's also simple if you go from a simplified Chinese version to another simplified Chinese version. You can generally roam your profile quite easily within a localized version. Well, the nice thing about the multi-language version is that it counts as one localized version. So it's easy to roam from one MLV version to another MLV version. Again, but it assumes that you've installed the language groups required on both of the systems. The way it works is that the way roaming works is that settings roam, but files don't necessarily roam. So, for example, if you might go from a Japanese system to a Korean system, and when you roam to the Korean system, the fact that your default input locale is Japanese will roam with you. But the files required for the Japanese input method won't necessarily roam, and therefore you might not be able to enter your name or your or Japanese text in general on the Korean operating system unless you've also installed the Japanese language group. So, and as I mentioned also, there are some special folders that are localized on localized versions. If you have, again, let's take that same scenario. You have a Japanese localized version. You have a Korean localized version. The Japanese program files directory is program file. And the Korean version will also have its own version of program files. So when you roam to the other one, it might end up actually creating a new directory for you with a different name, okay, because of the fact that you came from a localized system. Again, it depends on the path that you're dealing with and the situation. But these heterogeneous situations can cause problems with roaming, and that's why we encourage situations. If you're in a multi-language version or environment where you expect people to be roaming from one machine to another and to be use roaming profiles, we encourage you to use the multi-language version. Okay, now let's talk about sharing data. To share data among various machines, in Windows 2000, all that's required is that you have the appropriate language group installed. As I said, the language group installs, when you install a language group, it installs all files required to edit, display, print, and otherwise process text in that language. So that's all really that's required within Windows 2000. So you can have a mixed environment with multiple language versions of Windows 2000 and share data across them. Again, it depends on the application you're using, whether or not they support Unicode and so on. But in general, I mean, the system support is there for it. But keep that in mind. You do have to install the appropriate language group to get the support that you need. You'll need to install the appropriate input locales. We saw in the demo earlier a few minutes ago how to do that. Make sure that you install whatever input locales are required to enter whatever data the users are going to want to be dealing with. Okay, Sharing data application support. We talked a little bit about this. Basically, Unicode-based applications share data the best because, as I said, a Unicode character is unambiguous. So you can pass Unicode from one application to another easily. Okay? Even within inter-process communication within the system, or writing it to file and having another application pick it up, that's the best way to do it. With ANSI-based applications, basically an ANSI-based application supports data or text in whatever it thinks the system code page is. And if you've changed the system code page to something else, then that ANSI-based application will not behave correctly, and it will have its text that it gets from the system or it sends to the system will be translated incorrectly. And also, if you have a situation where you cut and paste from one ANSI application to another that are assuming different system code pages, you'll have a mishmash and you'll have corrupted data. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but on NT4, you could, in some cases, you could type in text, and if you had Unicode data in Notepad, for example, and you cut and pasted that into the old version of WordPad, which was ANSI-based, you'd see question marks in some cases, and that's because WordPad was an ANSI-based application, and Notepad can deal with data in either Unicode or ANSI. But if you, in the case where you used it with Unicode, then you would get that situation. Anyway, as we've mentioned before, in order to use an ANSI-based application correctly, you have to set the system locale to whatever that ANSI application is expecting. Japanese in the case of a Japanese application, Korean, Arabic, and so on. And also, there are some coding practices you have to be very careful of in order to use ANSI-based applications and support them correctly. And I would encourage you to read the logo requirements document, which is on the web, and that will give you what those best coding practices are. There are some ways to write a mixed Unicode ANSI application. It's best to avoid it if you can, but in some cases you have to do that. For example, if you want a Unicode application that runs on Windows 98, then you have to write one of these mixed applications. And there are ways to do that, which are also discussed in the web pages that we indicate at the end of this presentation. So let's summarize now. We've taken a long time here, but as I said, this is an exciting topic, and I hope you haven't fallen asleep and you've followed along here and found it as exciting as I have. Windows 2000 supports a lot of languages. Just most of the major languages that are in use today are supported by Windows 2000. It supports all languages in all versions of Windows 2000, and the multi-language version supports multiple user interfaces within one computer, within one system, as we saw in the demos. So let's talk about some deployment guidelines. When should you deploy localized versus multi-language version? We saw a graph of this earlier, but let's just review it. First of all, if your users require full localization, they have to have everything localized, then you'll want to stick to the localized version, okay? And if also in a situation where everyone in your office or everyone in your particular scenario requires the same user interface language, then you're probably okay with the localized version. In the situation there, though, where you have mixed cultures dealing with each other, and in an office or in an enterprise, you'll want to consider using the multi-language version, especially if they're okay with a small number of user interface elements that remain unlocalized, remain in English. Some more guidelines. To use roaming profiles, we mentioned this. It's best to use the same localized version of Windows 2000 or the multi-language version of Windows 2000 because that counts as one localized version. And you should install all required language groups on all relevant systems. So when someone roams from one system to another, they'll have that language group available. You'll want to avoid using non-ASCII characters in usernames and passwords and machine names as well, I should have said here. Again, this is just the best safe practice. If you've in theory, you shouldn't have to do this if you've installed all the language groups, but you may have forgotten to install a particular language group, and someone wouldn't even be able to log on that system if they have characters in their username and password that are not supported by that system. Okay, if you're using down-level clients, make sure that you restrict the names to ASCII, the computer names, file names, and that sort of thing on your domain, so that people in the Windows 95 and Windows 98 clients will be able to see those the file names and computer names, printer names, and so on. All right. Okay, and the third set of deployment guidelines is to create multilingual content, multilanguage content. You'll want to install all the required language groups for all of the languages that you want to display or edit or whatever, and install the required input locales for entering text in that data, and then use a Unicode application such as Office 2000, for example. I mean, if you're happy with Notepad, more power to you. You can use that as well, because it is also multilingual and enabled and uses Unicode. But I think most of our users will prefer to have something a little with a few more features than Notepad. And to exchange multilanguage documents, you'll want to install all the required language groups on all of the relevant systems. That way, even though you may not be entering text in Japanese on a particular system, but if you want to be able to display it, you'll want to install the language group required. Finally, final set of guidelines. If you want to use applications that are localized to various languages, then you'll of course want to install the required language groups. So again, if you're running a Korean application on your Chinese system, your traditional Chinese system, you'll want to install the Korean language group. Okay, if it's an ANSI application, that means you also have to set the default locale to, in this case, Korean, all right, and then reboot. And this means that now your Korean application, again, assuming it's written following certain guidelines, will run on that traditional Chinese system. But your traditional Chinese ANSI applications will not run properly. All right, you can't simultaneously run different ANSI applications that assume different system code pages. So that's a problem to be aware of. You'll have to reset the system locale back to traditional Chinese and reboot in order to run the traditional Chinese ANSI application. If it's a Unicode application, there's no such restriction. You'll be able to run the system, to run the application on any system with any system locale, system default locale setting. So that's another advantage of Unicode applications. This gives you some information, some places to go for more information, the TechNet website, and so on. So check out these websites if you'd like more information about these topics. Thank you very much. It's been nice talking with you.